Right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Dr. Shane McClellan, County Extension Agent for Ag in McLennan County. Absolutely would love for us all to be in person, see a lot of smiling faces. Other than the ones, the videos I see, this is like the 14th or 15th Zoom educational program that I've hosted. And that seems to be the way we're going to have to go for a little while. And maybe not the method I would prefer, but it is a good option rather than canceling and just not being able to share information. Today, we have a really good speaker with us, and I am looking through all of the stuff that I'm double dipping into so I can make sure I get all of her information correct. But I want to thank Carol Clark for coming to us and agreeing to speak today, and appreciate your time. And she's going to do several presentations with you today, but what I want to do is just tell you a little bit about her. Carol Clark is a Texas Master Naturalist, a longtime member of the Native Plant Society of Texas. She actually chairs Bring Back the Monarchs to Texas Committee of the Native Plant Society of Texas. She is a Monarch Watch conservation specialist. When she's not busy teaching others about pollinators and native plants, then she enjoys looking after her own a very large monarch way station and wildlife refuge that is in Cook County, and she spends a lot of time taking pictures of plants and insects. On the thing she's going to talk about today, we've kind of adjusted a little bit, and what Carol had mentioned doing was maybe doing 3 different presentations. But I wanted to go through what's on this bio of what she was going to talk about if we did 2 presentations, just because it gives you kind of a heads up of what we're going to do. And I won't be stealing any of her thunder, but it does give you a bit more information. The Monarch Waystations for Texas is what most of y'all are here for, but it covers a really big story of the monarch butterfly, the life cycle, the migration. It clarifies some of those common misconceptions that people have about monarchs. She's also going to explain the historic and current threats to monarch populations and why Texas is very important for the monarch's future success. The program is also going to cover steps that Texas residents can take to help support that monarch population, and how you can create a monarch way station of your own. Another thing that she's going to be talking about is monarchs and other pollinators. And on that, it's just sharing information how you can improve your garden's impact. You can learn kind of what plants offer benefits for monarchs and for other pollinators. She's going to finish a lot of that with just the best timing for mowing, maintenance, etc. of those plants. But like I said, she's going to really divide this up into 3 different programs. So we've got time for her to do that, and look forward to hearing what she is going to be talking about. I'll have to step out around 1 o'clock for another meeting that I'll start on my phone, but I'll still be listening, still be with you. If you have questions and you don't have a microphone, that's okay. Just put them in the text chat, and either I or Carol will look at those as we go, and we'll make sure that she sees those to answer those questions. But if you would, let's keep most of your questions to the end, unless she asks you a specific question. That way, we don't break her concentration, and we can all listen and learn. With that being said, there was 121 people that signed up for today, and slowly see more and more coming on. But we're at 70 now, and there's going to be more as we go. There's a question about can we get the recording or a copy of the slide set? And I'll record all of these, and I will be posting them. If you're a McLennan County Master Gardener, they're going to be on the volunteer management system. And then for everyone else, they will be uploaded onto the Master Gardener website for others that are not McLennan County Master Gardeners to review and to see. With that, I'm going to be quiet. I'm going to mute my microphone. And if I hear a lot of background noise, I'm going to mute those people too, other than Carol, of course. But remember, be professional. Your camera might be on whether you know it or not, even though it says it could be off. But everybody mute yourself, and let's learn. Carol, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, it's great to be here today, even if it is virtual. And I feel so lucky to finally get 2 hours to say what I want to say. A lot of times they'll try to stuff me into a 20-minute time slot, and I'll do it, but there's so much left on the cutting room floor if we do that. I could literally talk about monarchs and the plants that they use for hours and hours, but we'll get the most we can into 2 hours today. And again, as Shane said, we're going to divide this up into monarch waystations and that whole concept. The milkweeds will be a separate section, and then the nectar plants will be a separate section as well, with a little break in between for questions and for you to run and do whatever you need to do very quickly. Okay, so today we're in 2020, and 2020 has been full of odd stuff, not all of it good. And if you have been reading the news even before 2020 and COVID hit, you may feel sometimes a little overwhelmed by bad news. Like there's a lot of stuff going on in the world today that you don't really have any control over, that you can't impact in any way. And sometimes you might even feel a little insignificant, like there's just nothing you can do to improve the world around you. And I'm here with some good news today. There's a problem that you can impact, and you can start impacting that this afternoon in your own neighborhood, in your own yard, in your own state. And that is the problem of monarch butterfly decline. So let's learn about monarch way stations for Texas and what you can do to help. The Monarch Way Station concept was created at Monarch Watch at University of Kansas, and this is Monarch Way Station number 1 at University of Kansas. You can see that it has this nice, durable outdoor sign. And if you create a Monarch Way Station and register it, you can pay a nominal fee to get your own Monarch Way Station sign so that others can come along and read about what you're doing and why. What is a Monarch Way Station and why do we care? Monarch Way Station is simply a place that provides all the things a monarch needs to complete its life cycle: host plants, nectar plants, and shelter for monarch butterflies. That shelter can be as simple as a bunch grass or an evergreen shrub with dense foliage, or even a tree with dense foliage that would be leafy when the monarchs are residents in Texas. So it doesn't have to be a manufactured butterfly house or anything like that. Monarch way stations that meet really easy criteria can be registered with Monarch Watch at monarchwatch.org. There is a tab there for Monarch way stations, and it will tell you exactly how to apply. It's a simple application. It's not one you have to spend a lot of time on. You simply need to have nectar plants, host plants, and shelter plants in your garden, and then you can register your way station. Right now, there are over 25,000 registered way stations in the country, and Texas, I'm so proud of you, we are ahead. But one of those M states in the upper Midwest is catching up, and I feel like we just need to do our part as Texans and stay ahead. Again, you need 3 things. Nectar plants for adults. These can be almost any plants that you see other butterflies sipping nectar from. Monarchs have long tongues, so they can access the nectar at the back of a long tube flower or on those shorter tube flowers as well. And they're not too picky. If it's sweet, they'll like it. Monarch butterfly adults don't have chewing mouth parts. They have to drink nectar. You need milkweeds, or they're extremely close relatives, for the caterpillars to eat. And we'll have a whole section of the kinds of milkweeds that you might choose for your monarch way station after we do this first part. And those monarchs are going to be picky. They're going to come along and test each milkweed with little spines and chemical sensors built into their legs, so that they know they're laying their eggs on just the right plants for their kids. They will not lay eggs on a milkweed that isn't quite right for them. And shelter plans for those adults. Now, how about supplemental water? People ask me about this all the time. They say they see videos of monarchs drinking water while they're overwintering in Mexico. And yes, they do use water then, but that water is used to convert fat stores into energy during the winter. During the spring, summer, and fall, when you might see monarchs in Texas, and mostly in the spring and fall, they don't drink water. They get all of that liquid that they need from the nectar that they're drinking. So supplemental water is great for other butterflies. It's great for birds and other insects in your garden, but it's not necessary to apply for a monarch way station designation. You can skip that fountain design if you don't really want to do that part. Let's look at some places you could put a Monarch way station. They could be almost anywhere. Now, we recommend that for real effectiveness, they be at least 100 square feet, but that's only 10 by 10. And that 100 square feet can be spread out among several different modules, if you will. This one's long and linear. It is a roadside, a county roadside, and this man simply applied to the county to see if they would let him use this roadside. And if you do something along a roadside, most of your authorities are going to want a short mode strip right next to the road for visibility and safety reasons. And as you can see that he's got that, it shows behind that upper left-hand corner of the sign, but next to that, he's got all kinds of milkweeds and nectar plants for monarchs. Here's another one at a college. Here's Monarch Way Station number 1 again. This one is one that's near and dear to my heart. I love this one. These are master gardeners who put in modular Monarch way station in these little hexagons or octagons in a juvenile detention center. And they take the kids out for gardening lessons. They're learning gardening skills that they might be able to use for employment when they get out of there. It reduces the stress levels among the population that's confined there, and it gives them adult mentors that they can learn to trust. So it does all kinds of wonderful things while it supports the monarch population. I think this isn't just a win-win, it's kind of a win-win-win-win situation. Oh, I accidentally repeated a couple slides. Sorry about that because I have been cobbling together some programs. This one is at a Montessori school. This one is under the deck of a senior center. They had this unused utility area, and you can see what was there was a cinder block wall and some air conditioning units. Extremely ugly. And because of the shade of the building and so forth, the grass wasn't growing very well there. So it was just an ugly area before they converted this to a monarch way station. This one is at a county park. This one is at a school, and you can see a Girl Scout troop was instrumental in installing this one. This is my own Monarch way station, 36 acres. It's fine to go small, but if you have big and you can use that, that's fine. It doesn't have to be a manicured space. And believe me, this is nothing like a garden. It's very wild up there, but we do have nectar plants galore and milkweeds galore for those monarchs, and they use it. Think about using other people's space. Maybe you live in a place where you really don't have any space, a condominium without even a back porch. But look at all the places that you could think about putting a monarch way station. These have all been used by other people before. And some of those hotels, the way station has even been on the rooftop of that hotel. So think about all the unused spaces out there that might be benefiting monarchs if put to better use. Sometimes other people's money is going to be available for installation. You don't have to use all your own. I'm in charge of a committee called Bring Back the Monarchs to Texas through the Native Plant Society of Texas, and we run a grant program each year. Grant application season opens up around Thanksgiving and it runs into February, and after that we will decide who gets our grant money for the year. Those grants are capped at $400 per project right now, but we'd love to see applications come in from master gardeners with great plant lists and great designs. Doesn't have to be big to be effective. This is in a friend's front yard in Plano, Texas. His name is Michael McDowell, and if you'd like to go see his blog, it's at Plano Blue Stem. He converted his entire front yard to a prairie garden. He no longer has lawn. It's completely full of native plants and a few other plants for monarchs. And can you tell? It's effective. Look at all the monarchs he's attracted. His neighbors didn't necessarily understand what he was up to at first, but now they really get it. They can see the beauty that he has in his yard and that he has attracted to his yard with these mobile, beautiful flying insects. This is my front yard. I was inspired by Michael, and I have unlawned my front. And one day I was out teaching at a school. It was an all-day slog with 250 juniors and seniors. And I got to tell you, they can be a tough audience sometimes. So at the end of the day, I was having a conversation with the science teacher, and he said, sometimes I wonder if anything I do or say even makes a difference. And I thought to myself, wow, now I'm not only exhausted, I am depressed. And I went home and I went home in a blue funk just thinking, geez, does anything I do make a difference? I pulled up to my front yard and there was all this activity in the mid-afternoon in my front yard, and there were 13 monarchs in the process of nectaring from my garden and bedding down for the night to spend the night there. So, what is so special about Texas? What makes Texas crucial to the monarch survival? Because you, as Texas residents, are really in a critical place. Um, Monarchs need Texans to do the right thing. Otherwise, their migration is not going to survive and their species is going to be in even bigger trouble. They've declined a lot over the last 20 years. And by some estimates, they are down to, 5% of their former numbers. That's really, really low. And we should be doing what we can to help them. So the entire population of monarchs east of the Rocky Mountains, which kind of forms a natural barrier, depends on finding milkweeds when they migrate through Texas in the spring. How does this work? Well, down there at the very bottom of the map, you see the blue dot in Mexico. That's roughly where monarchs overwinter, in the mountains of Mexico. When spring begins to hit, late February, early March, those monarchs get restless and they begin to move north. And they fly straight through Texas. You can see the green arrows on that map coming up through Texas. They need to get a couple hundred miles into Texas before they really find a significant amount of milkweed to lay their eggs. They will lay a few between where they roost for the winter and the middle of Texas, but they lay an awful lot of eggs in Texas. And those eggs are going to look like tiny little pearly footballs with ridges. There's some reasons for the ridges. We do that in a different program, but it helps the eggs expand and contract with moisture. And just a couple of days later, those eggs are going to hatch. Now, these monarchs are so tiny that their mouths cannot even grab the milkweed and chew it at this point. They're going to turn around, eat their own eggshell for starters, and recycle some of those nutrients. And then they're going to wander off and start eating the fuzz on the back of the leaves because they're still so tiny. By 2 days old, they've grown just a little bit larger than the eye on the back of a US dime, and they're able to make tiny holes in the leaves. So remember, they're not very big when they're born, but as they grow, they eat and eat and eat. They shed their skin several times to accommodate all this growth. And within 2 weeks, they have grown to be about the size of your index finger, if you're my size. Their weight has increased to 2,000 times their hatch weight. Just imagine if people did that. They're ready to start making their chrysalis when they're about 2 weeks into the caterpillar stage, and they're going to hang in a J for about 24 hours. They're doing a lot of stuff inside their skin at this point. They're getting some parts ready for this part of the metamorphosis. And once they do start, it doesn't take long to split that skin, shed that skin, and form the moist chrysalis that you see here. Now, this doesn't look like most of the pictures we see of a monarch chrysalis. That's because it's still lumpy and irregular looking. It has not contracted to its finished look yet. This is immediately after they shed their skins. In about half an hour, it's going to be much firmer. It's actually going to feel like a piece of jade if you hold it in your hands. It's going to be firm and cool and dense. And when you hand somebody a chrysalis, they often ask, wow, who made this? Because they really do think it's a piece of jade or a piece of plastic that's been molded into chrysalis shape. Another 12 days or so, depending on the temperature, 10 days to 14 days as usual, that chrysalis will suddenly turn clear as the monarch inside peels away from the edges of its container. It's going to split open. The monarch will climb out. That can take a while. And they usually do it when you're not looking. So if you stop paying attention, they'll be all hatched out and you'll have missed it. And that monarch on the left there looks really funny. It's got a big distorted abdomen and little tiny munched up wings. That's totally normal. That abdomen is full of fluid. The fluid is going to be pumped into the veins in their wings. So the wings are not wet, but they are soft at this stage. They've not hardened. And that fluid is going to be pumped out into the veins to stretch those out and then back into the abdomen where it's going to be ejected. Remember, they've been in this chrysalis 2 weeks and there's been no place to pee. They have, it's time for them to eject some fluids at this point. Again, those wings are not fully expanded, but within a couple of hours, that monarch will have its wings fully expanded. They will harden up within about 3 hours. The females, and this is a male in this picture, but the females will take a couple of days to fully mature before they really want to breed and lay eggs. So they will do that. And remember, this is all happening in Texas where the eggs have been laid. So what do those monarchs do? Well, they're somewhere in Texas, or if those remigrants were very lucky, maybe they got to somewhere in Oklahoma, but not very far north, and usually in Texas. They're going to get ready to breed and continue to fly north, laying eggs the whole way and continuing this life cycle. When that second batch of spring eggs hatches out, those will be the monarchs that recolonize the entire eastern breeding range. And you can see that marked in yellow all the way up into Canada, all the way up into New England. There is milkweed all the way up to where that yellow portion stops. And the second generation of monarchs will spread out and fill that entire area. Once they get there, they're going to continue to breed and lay eggs as quickly as possible. And there should be about 2 more generations during the summer. Most of our monarchs here in Texas will be gone during the summer. They're mostly gone by May 30th. So if you need to mow a hayfield after May 30th is good. But the entire, I'm going to back up one slide because I want to tell you what they do after that. So at the end of the summer, something very different happens. That last generation of summer monarchs up here in the Midwest and Canada is born larger, they're born darker, and they're born with flight muscles equipped to fly long distances. And instead of going through the breeding cycle and breeding like crazy and spending their energy that way, they're going to fly all the way back to the overwintering grounds in Mexico. So that can be a really long trip from the edge of Canada here all the way back to Mexico. It's way over 1,000 miles. And the entire population of monarchs east of the Rocky Mountains, just like they were looking for milkweed in the spring and nectar plants for the adults, they have to find nectar plants as adults when they migrate back through Texas in the fall. What happens if they don't? It's like taking a long trip and finding 90% of the gas stations are just randomly closed. If they're closed, there's a good chance you're going to run out of gas and not make it on your long trip. And the same with the monarchs. They can't continue to fly forever and depend on those fat stores forever without refueling. And the way they refuel is with our nectar plants. They need them when they come through Texas. This is a photo of monarchs in Lewisville, Texas, gathering. They make these fall roosts where they gather together, usually in a low spot near water. They'll pick a tree or some vines hanging from a tree or some bushes and just sort of gather together for the night. There were actually hundreds or maybe thousands of monarchs in this area, but it was hard to get close without disturbing them. So I had to settle for these few gathered on one vine. As you get closer and closer to Mexico and all these monarchs are funneling through, the fall roosting sites get larger and larger and may involve quite a few monarchs. And as you get down into the mountains of Mexico, they begin to coat the trees in very specific overwintering sites that have exactly the right microclimates and exactly the right trees for them to successfully get through the winter. So these are the Oyamel fir forests in the mountains west of Mexico City, and there they are beginning to cluster in those trees. At times, they coat the trees so thickly in these overwintering sites that they look like orange leaves replacing the needles of those fir trees. This is a tree trunk completely encrusted with monarch butterflies in Mexico. And they've had some trouble with people cutting the trees, both legally and illegally, in these overwintering sites. So maintaining the climates, the little microclimate that they really need in these overwintering sites, not too hot, not too cold, not too wet, not too dry, is super important. And if people change those habitats by taking out a lot of these trees, then the monarchs can be in big, big trouble. That's one of the fronts we need to fight on. Then in the spring, when it warms up again, that entire life cycle starts over. So you can see Texas is right in the thick of it in the spring and in the fall. In the summer, most of our monarchs will have moved out of here by the end of May. We're not going to see very many at all in the summer unless you're in one of those odd locations in Texas where they just happen to stay for the summer. But any monarchs that are here after about June 10th are really stranded for the summer. They're not going to breed very efficiently in the extreme heat, and it's kind of a lost generation. When they get back to Texas in the spring, just think about it. They've gone maybe from the upper Midwest to Mexico and all the way back to Texas, and they really look like they've been on that a 3,000-mile journey. Some of them have. It's been that long. For most generations of monarchs that breed, they only live a month to 6 weeks, just a few weeks. But for this generation that migrates and then remigrates back to Texas in the spring, they can live 8 months, 9 months. So they're very different. And I don't know of another creature that really does this kind of thing. So here are some real steps that you can take to help monarchs in your landscape. Reduce or eliminate your personal pesticide use. I know as master gardeners, you're well versed in pesticide use and its dangers and its advantages. And you know that you should always reduce to the minimum that you need to use for your landscape because that just saves money, it's efficient, and it's best for our whole ecological situation. And refrain from mowing milkweeds in the spring. As I mentioned a couple of times, our monarchs in Texas are mostly gone by the end of May, or they're flying adults. So if you need to mow, mowing after May 30th is pretty good for most of Texas. And then during the summer, you're not really going to impact monarch production very much. In fact, you might even enhance the milkweed growth for the fall. When it sprouts back up, it will have tender new growth that monarchs might be able to use again at the end of the summer. We start to see milkweeds or monarchs filtering back into Texas in August, and some of them will breed once more before fall. I think someone has their microphone turned on. If you could mute yourself, that'd be awesome. Plant real nectar plants for the spring migration. I've got that word real in quotation marks for a reason. Sometimes we shop for plants that please us and they look great, but they don't really have a lot of nectar content. So we need to shop carefully for plants that are actually useful for monarchs and for other pollinators. And what I find is that native plants work really well for that, but so do old-fashioned plants that have been modified just slightly. Plants that have a lot of modifications, like heavy double and triple petals instead of those simple centers, actually provide physical obstacles to things that are trying to get nectar or pollen from the centers of those flowers. And they may not have the good nectar that they used to have in their original state. It may have been bred out of them in favor of some other characteristics that we like as gardeners. So think about plants that not only put up the great food sign, but actually have that great food available when the pollinators get there. Plant native milkweeds. I know there's a lot of controversy about whether to plant non-native milkweeds or native milkweeds, and I always like to err on the side of caution. We know that they use native milkweeds. We know that they can use some non-native milkweeds, but there are so many other creatures that use milkweeds in addition to monarchs, and we know very much less about them. We're not sure if they can actually use the non-native milkweeds effectively for their life cycles. So I prefer to plant the native milkweeds when possible. If you can't find any, go ahead and plant your non-natives, but then replace them when you can find a native milkweed. Real nectar plants, again, for the fall migration. Remember, those simple old-fashioned cultivars with the open centers are usually best. And then tell others that monarchs need milkweeds. It's surprising, but a lot of people have not really fully understood this story yet, or maybe haven't heard it at all. Finally, you can create and register your own Monarch way station. And if you want to purchase a sign that tells others what you're doing out there in your Monarch way station, then that's even better because your neighbors can walk by and get a quick glance that says, monarchs need these things, and maybe I should be doing that too. Hopefully that will cross their mind. All right, so I am going to pause here for questions before we get started on the milkweed portion, and then the nectar plant portion is coming after that. And Shane, are you still here?
I am. There's one question. Do you have suggestions for real native nectar plants?
I do. I have a whole 45 minutes of suggestions for real native nectar plants, and they are coming up soon. But if you can't wait that long, if I only had to choose one, I would probably choose Greg's Blue Mist Flower. And actually, milkweeds themselves make great nectar plants, surprisingly. And they make great nectar plants for lots of other species, not just monarchs. So we'll see that. Anybody else have questions on the way station concept or monarch timing, life cycle? Well, maybe.
Question. I have a question.
Sure.
I'm Sheila. Where would you, I used to live in Houston, so I was able to purchase milkweeds that had not been um, pesticides used on them, but where can you purchase milkweeds for your yards? I mean, I know that's difficult to find them from landscapers where they have not been, pesticides used on them. Do you know where you can get them?
Yes and no. That's going to vary season to season as growers have them and then run out of them, and nurseries frequently run out of them quite quickly when they have them in stock. So one thing I always recommend is calling your retailer first before you go to make sure that they have something in stock. You're right. There are quite a few good retailers in Houston that try to stock pesticide-free milkweed, and I actually have a slide asking everybody to always ask your retailers, have these been treated with any insecticides at any stage of their production? So McLennan County, you're down near, is that Waco? Am I correct there? Are you near Waco?
Yes, that's where we are.
Okay. I'm not as familiar with the resources near Waco, but there is a nursery that's mostly wholesale. It's appointment only, and I'd ask you to be respectful if you do decide to go out there of her time. Wright's Nursery in Briggs, Texas, generally has a good selection of milkweeds. Now, if you have some people that you can share milkweeds with, Monarch Watch has a growing program. They use seeds that I collect in Texas, and they grow whole flats of milkweeds for distribution back into Texas from the regions where those seeds were collected. And they're limited to flats of 50. You can't really get 4 or 5, but they're very economical. And they will arrive as 3 to 4 month old plugs with a little taproot already started. So if you can just find some people to share with and order next spring, you can get plugs of milkweeds through Monarch Watch. And that's economical because it's underwritten by federal, and well, national grants in any case, so that you're not actually bearing all the costs that the growers charge to produce them.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. There are others, and the Native Plant Society of Texas does have some native plant nurseries listed. I would try calling those. Any other questions before we move on? All right, I guess we'll launch right into part 2. So, monarchs definitely need milkweeds. What kind of milkweed is an interesting question. People always ask me, which milkweed do they like best? And the real true answer to that is, it depends. I could plant 3 milkweeds in my yard and have the monarchs choose only one of those. And my friend 3 blocks away could plant the same 3 milkweeds and have them choose a different one consistently. And so it's impossible to say which one they like best. We do know of some milkweeds that they choose often, and so I'm going to show you quite a few of those today that you might want for your landscape. That is a butterfly weed on the left in this cover slide and a green milkweed on the right, a particularly magnificent specimen, I might add, that was out in a restored grassland. A lot of my slides don't come from gardens. I hang out at visiting native plants where they live in the wild a lot, so mine may not look as manicured as they would in your gardens. Monarchs will eat not just the leaves of your milkweeds, they will also eat the flowers, and sometimes they'll eat the pods. I had a few captive milkweeds that I was rearing for a demonstration, and when I gave them new milkweed that had pods attached, I was astonished to find the caterpillars all left the leaves and gravitated right up to those tender pods and started eating the outside layers of the pods. So they will eat every bit of the milkweed if necessary, and they have their preferences. Who knows why? Milkweeds are full of toxic chemicals that monarchs sequester in their bodies to render them distasteful to most animals. So a bird may try one once, but they're unlikely to eat 2. And they really do gravitate to plants that have that chemical content just right. Here are some more milkweeds you might use. The first is the green milkweed. The Latin is literally green milkweed, or the milkweed that's green. That viridis means green. So you'll hear this called other things. Some people call it green antelope horns. It's very similar to another plant that's usually called antelope horns milkweed that we'll see next. I'm going to ask you to get in the habit of calling this green milkweed if you can, because there is perennial confusion between the 2 species, and it just keeps it clear for everybody if you'll do that. And as master gardeners, you can really help me with that statewide. Here it is close up, and you'll notice that there's a honeybee using the nectar from this plant as well. And that honeybee has some funny orange things stuck to its feet. Those are actually the pollen packets of a milkweed. Nothing collects pollen from milkweed on purpose and uses it like bees would collect pollen from other plants. They accidentally snag them. They get stuck to their feet, and then they get transported to new milkweed plants. But you're not going to find bees collecting milkweed pollen on purpose. This is practically a butterfly party, and these are only the butterflies that didn't move when I got close with my camera. There are not just monarchs, but so many other butterflies that will enjoy the nectar from milkweeds. Most milkweeds will make these seed pods up top when they start to mature if they've been pollinated. This is a green milkweed. These are all green milkweeds so far. And as those pods split open, all but one species will reveal seeds attached to little fluffy parachutes. And those parachutes enable the seeds to fly away and disperse on the wind so they can be planted in new places. Now, how effective is that for the plant? Well, not very. Estimates are that only about 0.5%, or 1 out of every 200 milkweed seeds that fly away, will actually take root and make it to be a second-year plant. It's a pile of cleaned milkweed seeds ready to go to Monarch Watch for growing those flats. Most of our milkweed species do not do what milkweed species from the Midwest and the Northeast do. They have a lot of species that form dense colonies. Ours are mostly taproot species. These are the taproots from underneath a green milkweed. The largest one is about 18 inches there. These look and feel a whole lot like sweet potatoes in texture. So they're not running sideways. These are vertical, and that plant of green milkweed is going to stay in one place for decades. It is not going to form a lot of other plants around it. Here it is in the landscape, blooming just about the time that the Texas paintbrush also blooms. These will rebloom if given enough water. Green milkweed can actually put on several blooms per season. It'll bloom heavily in the spring, which is, depending on where you are, you may start in April. Here it's usually May, and I'm further north than you are. And then it'll bloom again if it gets more water, and again in the fall. So you may get more than one season of bloom out of this. The next one is antelope horns milkweed, maybe one of our most beautiful milkweeds. It's less upright, has a more sprawling habitat, tends to spread out in a circle, but some of them will have their stems standing more upright. The buds are beautiful, like little tiny starfish pillows, and the flowers are quite beautiful close up. All milkweed flowers are divided into fives. You see little stars and little pentagons all through there. 5 petals, 5 hoods, 5 horns if they have horns. And here is a close-up of the entire flower head. These can be larger than a softball, these flower heads, so they're quite showy. And they will also, let's go back to just one slide. This species is going to take it hotter and drier than the green milkweed. Green milkweed is pretty flexible. You can find it in nasty shallow soils over limestone. You can find it in deep clay. You can find it in a drainage ditch sometimes. But this antelope horns is going to require better drainage than the others. It will prefer a rocky dry soil if you have that, or shallow soil. Butterfly weed actually kind of prefers a sandy soil, definitely good drainage on this one, but I'm finding people are having success with it in clay soils in a garden where that soil has been amended or at least has a lot of organic matter and slightly better drainage. And I have a lot of photos of this just because I love the way it looks in all stages. So there it is, just buds, and it's already pretty. But then look at these flowers. They're drop dead gorgeous. So a lot of gardeners really want this plant. And it's easy to propagate, so this is a popular choice for many gardeners who put in a monarch garden. Is it the most popular choice for monarchs? The answer is usually no. It's fuzzy everywhere. Its leaves and stems are a little bit stiff and fuzzy, and even the flower buds are fuzzy on this plant. And so it doesn't tend to be a monarch's first choice. It also lacks the milky sap that most other milkweeds have. And so it may just not have the chemical concentration that they prefer. That said, there are gardens where this milkweed is top choice, and I have no idea why it's so different from place to place. I can tell you no one else has any idea either, but Mother Monarch knows. Another one, Yerba de Zizotes or Zizotes milkweed or side cluster milkweed, Asclepias unothyroides, has very variable leaves. Sometimes they're really ruffly and a little frilly, and sometimes they're very oval shaped and more flattened. The flowers are in loose clusters right up against the stem, and the hoods and horns are held out away from the center of that flower while the petals turn back. So it's a little bit unusual looking compared to the others we've seen so far. Here's another view. This just came up in somebody's yard and they said, hey, I think I have a milkweed, come see. And sure enough, this had showed up in his lawn and it was blooming 6 inches high. It's going to be fairly flexible about what you do to it. Remember, they're used to being stomped on by buffalo and deer and things that roamed through here before we all settled here. And so they're durable. Once they have that taproot established, they'll be able to sprout back over and over again. Texas milkweed is pretty special. It's endemic to Texas and it's from the hill country, but it's usually found in sort of dry shade, which is really odd for a milkweed. A lot of these are full sun plants. The Texas milkweed is doing super well in gardens in North Texas, even where it gets more sun than it would in the wild, but it can also be put in the shade. So that makes this one a little bit more flexible in terms of where you're going to use it. Mine is on its third set of blooms this year. It bloomed, it quit blooming, and it just started blooming it again and again. So it's been great. And it's been one of those things that has bloomed right through the heat of summer when other things are suffering a little bit and taking a break. Swamp milkweed. This is one that you can use very well where you are. In the wild, it's usually found near the creeks, but that name is a bit of a misnomer, swamp milkweed. It really does not require as much water as you would think it does, and it does really well in your average garden soil. So I would definitely think about including this one. It's doing super well in gardens from Houston to Dallas to the Hill Country. I'm getting lots of good reports on that one. It's not just good for monarchs. Remember, everything else is going to use these too. That's a little metallic sweat bee. There are some named cultivars of the swamp milkweed. Some of them are white, and you'll find things with a name like Ice Ballet on the Asclepias incarnata. So that's going to be one of the white ones, and I think there's another named white variety that you can usually find at nurseries. They're still good, and the monarchs do like them. Here's one that might be a little harder to find and probably not first choice for monarchs simply because it gets started a little bit later. But it's going to be there at the end of the summer if there are monarchs that come back through and want to do a little bit of fall breeding. So Asclepias viridiflora, green flowered milkweed, wand milkweed, green comet milkweed. It has a lot of common names. That's why I tend to go with the Latin names if possible. Excuse me, that's my own phone interrupting. I am just going to turn that off. And honestly, this one is weird. It always looks like it's put together upside down. The leaves kind of stick up instead of drooping down. A lot of times that center vein will be prominent on top of the leaf. It'll stick out on top of the leaf and be smooth or recessed on the bottom of the leaf. What does that? That's weird for a plant. And even the flower clusters kind of look like they're attached upside down. So it's a little weird for a milkweed, but it's beautiful. And those flowers are going to range from all green to purple and green. It's quite a beautiful plant. Here it is in the wild. Those pods are upright and smooth. They look a little bit different than the pods on the green milkweed. Here's one you may not find in a nursery. If you do, this one actually forms a colony. The one we just saw will be one straight stem, but this one forms a colony. However, it's so lacy and light, you're not really going to have it bullying things out in your garden. It can mix right in with your other plants, and you'll hardly even notice that it's there. These leaves are extremely slender. The flowers are small, and they can be sparse like the one on the left or dense like the one on the right. This is one of our slim-leafed milkweeds, the whorled milkweed. That word whorl, W-H-O-R-L, means arranged in a circle, and the leaves are arranged 3 or more at a node. That's why it's called whorled milkweed. Look at all the things this attracts. You've got all kinds of weirdo looking beetles. Those are variegated fritillaries on the bottom left. They were fighting to get onto this milkweed down in the long grass of my wildlife refuge. And I always find an assortment of interesting beetles on this plant, as well as butterflies. Here are the pods. They can be a little bit thicker or a little bit slimmer, and I think that's in part site dependent. I think the tougher the conditions, that maybe the slimmer the pods turn out. And there they are shedding their seeds again. Now we're going to get to some milkweed relatives. There are more milkweeds in Texas, and if you want to see all the Asclepias genus that live in Texas, then I advise you to go Google Texas Parks and Wildlife Identification Milkweeds. And what will pop up will be a link to a guide that they've published. These are your great taxpayer dollars at good work, and you can download that guide and keep it forever. It will show you where in the state all our native milkweeds live with their range maps. They will have descriptions and site descriptions about the kinds of things that they require to. So that's the Texas Parks and Wildlife's Identification Milkweeds, and that should come right up in a Google search. Now, we do have some relatives of milkweeds that aren't in the genus Asclepias in Texas. We have things like Matilia, Funastrum, Cynanchum, and Gonolobus that are all related. This one is a low creeping vine, Matilia biflora. It means twin flowered. And it is going to have these fuzzy, bumpy pickle pods that lie right on the surface of the ground and take a long time to mature. But that might make a neat ground cover for an area that you have. Where I find this in the wild, it's frequently really tough, dry soils, really nasty, difficult areas. So it might make a really nice ground cover for you. Here's one that's a bit more rowdy. This one will really take off and start popping up everywhere and cover a large area, the honey vine or blue vine, Cynanchum leiva. If you had an extremely large, ugly fence that you wanted to cover, this will do the job for you, and monarchs will use this quite happily. Anglepod milk vine. Here's one that I photographed in the wild. You can see why it's called anglepod. It has these little flanges or wings or flaps on the pods that stick out at an angle. And it has those paired opposite leaves that all the milkweed relatives have when they are vines, and the odd looking little flowers, but it's going to make a great host plant if you have a space for a less aggressive vining milkweed in your landscape. This one will climb, unlike the twin flowered, which stays flat on the ground. Oops, not advancing. There we go. And finally, the elephant in the room, I've got to talk about the tropical or Mexican milkweed. Now, there are people who will tell you this is native to Texas. I am telling you, it absolutely is not. It is from South America, and because it's been moved around by humans for centuries, it has now been naturalized and may appear to be native in some new places like Mexico. It's not even native to Mexico. So calling it Mexican milkweed is still kind of a misnomer. This milkweed would not have normally, centuries ago, before people started moving it around, would not have been native anywhere on the monarch's normal migration flight path. So they would not have encountered this plant. Why is this important? Well, we're not sure. It's not really fully known exactly which chemicals monarchs need in which quantities, and it's certainly not known what those other creatures need in which quantities and which plants will fulfill those needs perfectly. So if you stick with native milkweeds for your region, then you know you're not doing anything harmful by accident. There's one other problem with the tropical milkweed that's come to the attention of scientists, and that is that it doesn't always go dormant in really warm areas. San Antonio in sheltered locations, down in Houston and Galveston, places like that, this will stay out and flowering and leafy all through the winter. And when it does that, concentrations of a monarch sort of parasite thing that's normally just called OE because the name is Ophryacistus electrospira, too long for most people, will build up on the plants, and then they will be transferred to the caterpillars infecting the adult monarchs. And so we don't want those parasites to build up. If you grow this plant, you can avoid that by simply cutting it back short a couple times a year. You can cut it back after the spring breeding season, and you can cut it back again before they come through in the fall to ensure that you'll always have nice clean foliage that is not parasite rich for these monarchs when they come through. So you're going to hear a lot of fussing and feuding about this plant on the net. I prefer the natives simply because I think they do the most good for the most creatures. But if you plant this because you can't find natives in your nurseries yet, be aware there are some considerations. It comes in a few cultivars, including one called Silky Gold that's more of a yellow. And to tell that apart from the tropical and the butterfly weed that's also orange but happens to be native, look at the leaves and the stems. Butterfly weed has hair all over its leaves and stems, bristly hairs that you're going to be able to see with the naked eye when you get close. The tropical milkweed is very smooth, and that is a difference that you're going to be able to see at the nursery. You're going to be able to see it in the landscape. And when people send you pictures as master gardeners, you'll be able to tell them which plant they have. Most importantly, we kind of already covered this, whenever you purchase plants, ask your nurserymen, has this plant been treated with any insecticides at any point? Avoid the question that sounds like, did you treat this plant? Why? First of all, that makes them defensive right off the bat. Second of all, they can honestly answer that no, and there will still be pesticides in that plant because they didn't treat it, but that treatment happened somewhere back in that plant's history at the growers before it ever hit the retail nurserymen. So you want to ask the right questions. Can you ensure that these are pesticide free? Now, given that, they may really believe it when they say, no, they're absolutely clean, and they might still be wrong. Reputable nurseries that have tried really hard to get clean milkweed still sometimes fail to do so. And the reason is, ultimately, it's the guy with the spray wand in the greenhouse that has to get the message. He may even have been told by his boss or her boss that this needs to be skipped because it's a host plant. But if they forget or they didn't quite understand the instructions, those plants get to the retail nursery poisoned anyway. So be patient with your retailers, try to work with them, but remind them, we want these pesticide free. So it's their responsibility to keep checking with their growers. Are you doing this right? Are you getting us the plants clean that we need to have clean? And this is the same for any host plant that you plan to plant for any kind of caterpillar. They need to be insecticide free. All right, so that concludes the milkweed portion. Does anybody have questions related to milkweeds you'd like to ask at this time? And is Shane still here? Shane may be on his other thing at this point.
I am, but I muted it.
Okay.
There's a question about the best time to plant milkweed seeds or transplants.
Okay, well, I can cover this at some length because it looks like my time is pretty good. I've only used up about an hour. So milkweed seeds, there are several ways to do that. You can plant them in the fall. A lot of our milkweeds need a cold, moist period to break dormancy and germinate well. And if you plant them in the fall, then you're counting on winter to do that cold, moist treatment for you. Or you can take milkweed seeds that are dormant and put them in your refrigerator in, say, the 1st of December. And then and you're going to put those in damp vermiculite or damp peat moss or damp sand, something that's fairly sterile and just holds enough moisture to keep them damp but not soggy. You're going to put them in your refrigerator for about a month and take them back out. Once you take those out, you open the bag, you spread that out on a countertop, let them get some light, but not direct sunlight because they may cook inside that bag. And within about 10 days, you're going to see good germination of most of our milkweed species, particularly the green and the antelope horns really benefit from this treatment. And Monarch Watch does cold, moist stratify all their seeds for 4 to 6 weeks. So you do that, then you plant them when they have just a couple of leaves or even before they get their true leaves in a deep pot, but not necessarily a wide pot because they don't need that width, they do need depth. So a 6-inch narrow pot is perfect for those. And let them grow in those pots for at least 3 months before you transplant out. That way they'll have a start on a tap root. And that'll put you right in the middle of spring when it's great to put out small plants. You might need to protect those tiny plants from monarchs the first year because they may literally be eaten to death before they have a chance to really develop a robust taproot underneath. But once they have the beginnings of a taproot, even if they get knocked off or eaten once, they'll come back. And that's good to know. All of our milkweeds are perennial except that tropical, which is a little bit tender. As far as planting plants goes, if you have potted plants, I would put those in the fall or the spring. Um, and, and you can even get away with planting them in the summer sometimes, but you can expect them to sulk. No matter when you plant them, they might just disappear for a bit and you think, oh no, the thing is dead. It's probably not. If it had a taproot, it's coming back almost certainly. The easiest way to kill milkweeds in Texas is probably with too much water for most species. So once you put those in, you're going to water them in thoroughly, maybe water them once or twice more, and then leave them alone. Anybody else with questions? I think
Yes.
There's several.
Shane, you can go to your other meeting and let them unmute themselves if you want to do it that way.
Well, there's several in the text chat.
Okay, I can't actually see that for some reason
Yeah,
without stopping.
you can as a speaker. The first one is, if a plant has been treated with an insecticide, how long will the effects affect that plant? In other words,
Okay.
how long before it can be considered safe?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And the answer is it varies. If it is a surface treatment, sometimes you can rinse those off and it'll be okay. Or strip off the leaves, let it develop new leaves, and it'll be okay. If it is a neonicotinoid that's been applied to the soil, that can have long-lasting effects throughout the plant tissues. And those can last months. So it depends on how much and when it was applied. If you get a plant, you might want to test it on one caterpillar. Just let one caterpillar be your test guy. And if it dies pretty quickly, you're going to know that's a contaminated plant and you need to isolate that plant, not let anything else use it until probably the next growing season. You can strip off all your leaves, wash off all your roots, discard the soil, and replant the plant. And within a couple of months, it may be okay.
Next question, can you recommend any milkweeds that are perennials for North Texas?
Sure. My favorites are the green, the antelope, the zodies, the swamp milkweed, the Texas milkweed, and butterfly weed for some locations.
Good information. The next question is, can you dig up wild milkweed from a field and plant it in a garden?
That's a really good question. So let me start this with some caveats. You need to be responsible about what you're doing. I cringe every time I read some Facebook groups are encouraging people to go dig up milkweeds from the roadsides and take them home. Well, there's a chance that you've killed the wild plant and your transplant won't survive when you do that. So you may actually be having a net negative effect on monarchs and their populations when you do that. But if you're out in a cow pasture and you're looking around and you see hundreds of milkweeds and the owner of that cow pasture has given you permission, I'd say, yes, you can try to transplant a milkweed. Butterfly weed does not transplant well once it is fairly mature. I would skip that one. But the antelope horns and the green milkweed can be transplanted from sections of their large established tubers if you are careful. I would take some of the soil that's with it. And if you must transplant responsibly, remember responsibly is really the key here. You don't want to denude the wild landscape doing this. But if you know a farmer that's about to spray his whole field anyway, or the bulldozers are rolling, by all means try to rescue those plants. Anyway, once you've got that dug out, you may have broken the taproot off. That's pretty common. Wrap the whole top of the plant in wet cloth or wet paper towels or something like that. Keep it in the shade. Wrap most of the root in wet stuff too, and leave just the exposed broken end to seal off for a day or two before you plant that plant. It's likely you'll lose all the above ground portions that it will sulk once you put it in, but that gives that cut part a chance to seal off, and it should regenerate from the taproot once you transplant that. I hesitate to recommend it because I know that there's always the possibility that people will do the wrong thing and go steal milkweeds from people who love them where they are. Don't do that.
Carol,
Yes.
I am a milkweed waste station or a Monarch waste station, so thank you for telling us about that. I mostly have tropical milkweed because I cannot find the native milkweed. I've gone places. Twice I've been burned by pesticide spray. The second time I asked and they told me, oh no, these haven't been sprayed.
Yeah.
Yet my caterpillars died.
Yeah.
So I really am wanting to use native milkweed, but having a great problem trying to find it. I live in Galveston County.
Okay. There are some, so Galveston County, you actually have some nurseries in the Houston area that are pretty good. And I would suggest that you contact the Native Plant Society chapter in the Houston area because they know exactly where they are. And they chat amongst themselves about who's got milkweed in stock. In the Houston area, there's also a Facebook page called, what is it called? It's called Monarchs and Milkweeds Network Houston area, something like that. And they'll get on there and say, hey, so-and-so's got this milkweed in stock right now. And so that will be a good resource for you. You can also check to see what is on the Native Plant Society state page in terms of native plant nurseries that may have milkweeds for you. Or you can try Monarch Gateway. Barbara Keller-Willie is in the Houston area, and she's doing great work getting milkweeds distributed in that area.
Okay, thank you. I have met her several times, and she won't really sell to individuals, which I understand.
Right.
So I kind of met a roadblock. But thank you for the information on the sites, and I will certainly try that.
That Facebook page, the Monarch and Milkweed Network Houston area, they are using her grow out procedures and providing milkweeds to people in some cases. So you want to go read all their stuff and get in touch with them.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
There's more in the text chat. There was a question about the green milkweed botanical name. They got VIR, and that was it.
Oh, okay. VIRIDIS, viridis. Okay, Asclepias viridis. All the true milkweeds are Asclepias genus.
There is a question about how do you get people over the word weed, and that's an interesting question because for me, antelope horn milkweed is a weed because I have it in my hayfield, and people talk about spraying pesticide on it. Antelope horn milkweed is hard to get rid of a hayfield. It is resistant to most herbicides, whereas some milkweeds may be not tolerant of them at all. Antelope horn is a tough customer.
It sure is, and it's because it's got a giant taproot that's snaking around underground there, and so you got to poison the whole thing if you're going to poison it. So the thing about milkweeds is they've gotten a really bad rap. There are stories about milkweed being super toxic to livestock and animals, and people worry about that a lot, and I understand why. But the truth is that most of our Texas milkweeds are not that toxic. They taste really terrible because of the latex sap, so they're super bitter. And you will find that horses and cows will not touch it if given a choice. Where I pick pounds and pounds of milkweed seed each year is the middle of a cow pasture. And the milkweeds are standing up tall and everything else is eaten down to nubs because the cows simply won't eat it if given any other choices. Stories about livestock poisonings usually come from the cattle drive days where herds of either sheep or cows were driven long distances and then penned up for the night in a temporary stockade. And sometimes those stockades had every bit of vegetation eaten and trampled, and the only thing left when the starving animals were put in for the night were some of our more toxic milkweeds, some of the slim-leafed milkweeds that grow out in West Texas. And in that case, yes, there were a few livestock poisonings that came out of that, but they have to eat so much to be affected in terms of their body weight, a certain percentage, that it is extremely unlikely that your cows in your pasture or your horses in your pasture are going to be harmed by native milkweeds just doing their thing out there. Now for hay, you may not want that in the hay, but antelope horns is a low plant. It's not really a tall plant. So you can reduce the amount of antelope horns in your hay simply by haying a little bit taller. As far as the term weed goes, I think milkweeds just need a new publicist. Maybe they need to be called milk marvels or something like that. Are there any other questions? Oh, Shane may be on his other.
There's not any more questions on the text chat.
Okay, so at this time it's 1:10. Do we want to take a 5-minute break and everybody just show back up in a couple of minutes? People may need to take a potty break or something, or we can just launch right into the last part. No feedback. So
Doesn't matter. We can do either.
all
Do you
right,
need a
so
break?
I'm good. So I can just carry on all day. I think we can just go ahead and roll, and that way we'll have time for more questions at the end if people have them.
Okay.
All right. So now let's talk about those all-important nectar plants. There's been a lot of emphasis on milkweeds, but there also needs to be emphasis on the nectar plants. And remember, when do monarchs need those nectar plants? In the spring when they're coming through, and in the fall when they're coming through. Not as much in the summer. That doesn't mean other things won't appreciate those in the summer. Your main goals are to have something blooming the entire warm season, something that provides good quality nectar at all times. That doesn't have to be the same plant. As master gardeners, you know about succession gardening. It can be first one plant and then the next and then the next. So you can cover the whole growing season by choosing different plants. Provide an assortment, not just one kind. That way they can be picky and choose the nectar that is nutritionally right for them. And then invest in diversity to assure that the garden's usefulness to monarchs and other creatures is maximized. The more diverse your plantings, the more you're going to benefit other creatures. I would still recommend planting things in groups of 3 to 5, maybe not single plants of a million different plants, but diversify your gardens for best impact. Milkweeds themselves are good nectar plants when they're blooming, but they're not always in bloom. A large fraction of the plants you plant should be from the composite family if your goal is to benefit pollinators. So things from the aster family, like sunflowers, daisies, liatris, coneflowers, mist flowers, goldenrods, those are all examples of things from the aster family. And they make really good pollinator plants for 2 reasons. One, their pollen is designed to be moved by pollinators, so they automatically attract them for that reason. And 2, they are built in such a way that when the pollinators visit, they don't have to go far for the next flower. They simply walk over to the next one, because these are not single flowers, even though we look at them that way. They are multi-flowers, composite flowers. A sunflower is actually hundreds and hundreds of flowers in one big head. Other high-value options for pollinators include simple flowers that are congested into a dense inflorescence. You get kind of the same effect. So things like buttonbush or ringo or verbetas, lantanas, salvias are frequently having a lot of flowers in a small area. So those things are also high-value plants for a lot of pollinators. When using plants from the other parts of the country, you master gardeners already know this. It's not just the winter tolerance, but the heat tolerance and the drought tolerance that you need to consider for Texas. And in Texas, sometimes those things are even more important than whether it will survive the cold. If you bring a plant that monarchs like from other parts of the country, be aware when you plant it here, its chemical composition may change due to the increased sunlight, increased temperatures that it's going to face in Texas. So it may not be as good for monarchs here as where it grows in Virginia, and your cousin has it in their monarch way station. Okay, so is all this just for monarchs? No, no, no. It's for lots of other things. It's for the monarchs and the queens. The queens are first cousins to monarchs, and they also require milkweeds for their larvae. There are lots of other butterflies that aren't so famous. They're not monarchs, not queens, but they will use the nectar from these plants. These are all milkweeds, by the way, in these photos, but the nectar plants will serve them as well. There's actually a moth called the unexpected cycnia that has to have milkweeds to survive. And all of these other creatures that depend on milkweeds, and some of these will also use the nectar. Those slides are kind of misplaced. They probably should have been back in the milkweed section. Our first real nectar plant is buttonbush, and these are in alphabetical order by Latin. So if you're looking up there and you see this starts with a C, we're going to end up in the Z's at the end, and you can tell, sort of gauge how far along we are. I love this plant. It blooms in the summer, so may not be perfect for monarchs, but monarchs will use it when it intersects with their journeys through Texas. Look what else uses it. Bumblebees, painted ladies, American ladies, lots of other things. This is a bumblebee that is now red listed by an organization that lists creatures as endangered and so forth. It's not a federal listing, but they're so concerned about this particular bumblebee, and here it is on a buttonbush. They love this plant. This is a Southern Plains bumblebee. The second one is echinacea, and this one is Echinacea purpurea. Almost any echinacea that blooms when the monarchs are coming through will work. This one is native to Texas, but guess where? It is native to one little corner of Northeast Texas, right near Arkansas. So what is special about that corner that's not the same as Dallas or the Hill Country or other parts of Texas? It's the rainfall. They get a lot more rainfall than we get, and it's a little bit cooler. So it's going to require a little bit of supplemental water. If you put it in a Hill Country garden or even a Dallas garden, you can expect this one to require a bit of supplemental water from you. If you plant a different coneflower that's native to Texas, something like Echinacea pallida or Echinacea angustifolia, you'll find that the water requirements are far fewer. These have narrower leaves. They're a little bit silvery. They are a little bit fuzzier than the leaves of the other coneflower, and so they're not going to require as much water. On the other hand, if you're in Houston, you've got plenty of water, so you probably want to go with the purpurea or a different coneflower that's suited to your region. But think about some of the ones that are really native to Texas if you're trying to reduce your water usage. You can see that lots of things use them. Here they are in the wild, growing themselves. Imagine how beautiful they could be in your garden if you just gave them a little extra attention and some space by themselves. And here they are at my wildlife refuge on a windy day. So all the petals are blowing one direction. All the butterflies are facing one direction. But the butterflies were literally fighting for space on the coneflowers that particular day. And these are native to that prairie region where it's very, very dry in Cook County. The next plant is Engelmannia peristinia, sawtooth daisy or Engelmann's daisy, and I think it has a couple of other common names as well. You can see where it gets the common name of sawtooth from the leaves. It's got this beautiful cut lacy foliage, and then big sprays of yellow daisy-like flowers up top. And the neat thing about this plant is the foliage looks great even when it's not in bloom, and it blooms for a long time, attracting a lot of pollinators. So I really like to include this one in any garden whose purpose is benefiting pollinators. Here's one that you'll seldom see in gardens. You may see a relative. A lot of people have sea holly in their gardens. This is our local native counterpart, Eryngium leavenworthii, usually just called Eringo. And it's an annual. It's a really spiky annual. And if you're like Shane and you have a pasture, you may have eliminated this from your pasture because it is so very sharp that it can actually endanger your pets and your livestock that get into that pasture. But if you have a place that's a little bit out of the way where you could afford to let this spiky annual grow, look at what it does. So many pollinators love this plant, including the monarchs. It's a fall bloomer. It's just coming into bloom now, and it will bloom right on into October here in North Texas, which is, sort of when the monarchs are coming through. We're going to see them in September and October. And so it's great for all sorts of pollinators if you have a place where you don't have to work around it a lot. This picture pretty much says it all. There's a European honeybee coming in from the upper right, a carpenter bee in the center, and there's the praying mantis. You're always going to find predatory insects on this plant. Why? Because they know the pollinators are going to show up. Now, I said before, if I could only have one nectar plant, I'd probably have to choose a Greg's Blue Mist flower. And monarchs and queen butterflies absolutely adore this plant. They're kind of programmed genetically to seek out this plant and its close relatives. Other things that are called mistflower, other eupatoriums or conocliniums share a chemical with the Greg's Blue Mist flower that some of these butterflies actually need. Queens and monarchs, the males of that species, both have that little dark mark on their wings, and that is a patch where the queens will sequester a pheromone that they use in their courtship. And to be successful in mating, the queens really need to make this pheromone, the males do. The monarchs still have those patches, but they don't actually use them anymore. They have the patches and they have this strong desire to go nectar from this plant, but they don't actually need it to survive like the queens do. But as you can see, they are strongly attracted to a Greg's Blue Mist flower. And usually you'll see a combination of both queens and monarchs nectaring from this plant. Another reason this is great for Texas gardens is that it has an incredibly long bloom season in many gardens, and it is tough as nails. It's really easy to grow. There's another photo from Michael McDowell's yard. He has a lot of Greg's Blue Mist flower tucked in with his other natives, and you can see what the monarchs are doing in his yard. Here's another eupatorium related to the Greg's Blue Mist flower, and not just monarchs, but every other pollinator imaginable uses this plant. Now, can I wholeheartedly recommend that you take this and put this in your garden? No. If you're working on a landscape scale, it's a fabulous plant. Or if you have sort of a muddy ditch and you need something to put in there, this is a fabulous plant for that. But it will spread like crazy. And for that one reason, I can't really wholeheartedly recommend that you do that unless you're willing to sign up for the work of keeping it under control. Another one that's better behaved is the shrubby boneset. And just like the name implies, it is a shrub. So this one will bloom very late in the season, which does great things for your garden when other things are starting to suffer in the fall and it's still hot. This thing is just getting started, and it will host an awful lot of butterflies that are there seeking the nectar. I should be careful of that word host because I don't mean in the caterpillar sense this time. I just mean it will welcome those butterflies who come for the nectar. That is a queen butterfly down in the center. You're going to notice the difference between that and the monarchs is that the queens will have white dots in orange spaces, and the monarchs do not do that. Another favorite plant of mine, and as much for the long bloom season as anything else, is this prairie verbena. It's a Texas native that you're going to find growing in cracks in a parking lot and in tough places, construction sites, the edges of waste areas that nobody's using. You're going to find this plant blooming its head off. And it will start blooming maybe in February some years and go all the way through until frost if it doesn't have a really, really tough summer. If it gets any supplemental water at all, it should bloom the whole time. I actually transplanted one from under a swing set in a public park where I could see that it was getting repeated tramplings in compacted soil and was never going to be able to bloom. I transplanted it to my garden and in July, and the thing survived. So these are just tough as nails. Doesn't need a whole lot of extra TLC from you, but it's going to be there when the monarchs come through in the spring. When very little else is blooming in the early spring, these will already be started. Sunflowers. So almost every sunflower is going to be a native favorite because our pollinators just love them. And Helianthus annuus is native here. It's the annual sunflower, but we also have a whole bunch of perennial sunflowers that you could choose for your yard. Some of them will bloom in the middle of the summer when monarchs aren't really present in Texas, but a lot of them bloom in the fall at just the perfect time for monarchs to come back through. So this is your common annual sunflower. It's big, it's unruly. It can kind of take up an awful lot of space in the garden. And so you may not choose this for a small area, but for a big area, it's great. The Maximilian sunflower is not going to bloom until fall. And once it gets started, it's going to put on a fabulous show with very little supplemental water or very little supplemental care. If it gets supplemental water, it can get tall. It can get 8 feet tall and kind of overwhelm the plants near it. It can also spread sideways and form sort of a thicket. So you want to be careful where you place a Maximilian sunflower. But if you have a way to keep it contained or you're willing to weed it out at its perimeter where it's spreading, this is a fabulous fall bloomer. Here's a monarch on a Maximilian sunflower out in the wild along the railroad tracks. Another great fall blooming sunflower is going to need a really special space because this one can get 12 to 18 feet tall easily. It does love a wet place, so if you have a ditch that needs banks stabilized, this one will spread via rhizomes, fill in that ditch, and this may be what you need to prevent erosion in that site. But it's, again, going to get to be a very tall plant. Blooms in the fall, so it's good for their migration. Lantanas have a long bloom season, and I have here the Lantana urticoides. Used to be called Lantana horrida because it's got an interesting smell to it if you rub the foliage. This one is our native. There are non-native lantanas. The nectar quality varies a little from lantana to lantana, so some are better than others. Some of the really fancy cultivars are pretty, but you won't find that many pollinators choosing them to nectar from, and I gotta think they know what they're doing. So I'm gonna stick with the Texas native, which is so pretty on its own, this orange and yellow one. It's always gonna be orange and yellow. If you see pink, or plain pure yellow or white or purple on your lantana, that is not a Texas native lantana. It's a hybrid or a species from another place. All right, there she is enjoying that in the fall. Prairie gayfeather. Yes, if I could only choose 10 plants, this would be on my list for North Texas in particular, because it is reliably going to bloom when the monarchs come through. It's a plant that has a corm underneath for energy and moisture storage, and it also has 8-foot roots below that. So it's going to be drawing moisture from way below the soil surface and then storing it in that corm, which means that it can draw on its own resources to keep blooming even where we're under watering restrictions and it hasn't rained and you're having a tough year. This will probably still find a way to bloom. So you can see it's not just monarchs, but all kinds of butterflies, all kinds of bees, all kinds of other creatures really love this plant. Other liatris are great for butterflies, but they may not bloom at the right time of year. So you need to do some research on the bloom season if you're planting liatris for monarchs. Here it is in the wild at my farm. No supplemental watering whatsoever. This is just out in the field. And just imagine what it looks like in your garden if you give it just a little bit of care. Turk's cap, here's a favorite all over Texas, and this one is a woody perennial. It can be trimmed back, it can be shaped. It is so flexible in its requirements. You can grow this in full sun to full shade and everything in between. It can be taller or shorter, just depending on the genetics of that particular plant and its growing conditions. But again, you can shape these as needed. And the very cool thing about Turk's caps is that this thing is going to start blooming when other plants are just struggling to stay alive. It's going to leaf out late in the spring, so don't think it's dead. It's coming later. And it won't even start to bloom until the temperatures get really hot. Once it starts to bloom, though, it will bloom right until frost. You're going to find mockingbirds love the fruits on this. Hummingbirds love the flowers as well. And monarchs will use that even in the shade. They really do like the nectar, and their tongues are long enough to access it on these very unique looking flowers. There's another monarch and bumblebee favorite, pitcher sage, Salvia azurea. It's a tall sage, and you want to plant this with supporting plants around it because it will get tall and flop over. Its native habitat includes a lot of tall prairie grasses, so it would be supported by those surrounding grasses under normal circumstances. Another sage related, another salvia, is the mealy blue sage, Salvia farinacea. And it is a pollinator powerhouse. All sorts of things love this. The bloom season is really long, and it is pretty flexible in its requirements. I have some in the shade right now that's not blooming well, but when I see it in other people's gardens, it's looking great, and they don't seem to need a lot of green thumbedness or extra care. We have some cultivars. The Henry Dulberg is still popular with pollinators. It does not seem to have reduced nectar quality. And Henry has the deep blue stems in addition to the nice looking flowers held above the foliage. There's also an Augusta Dulberg that's white. So you could choose either of those if you are using a cultivar, or just go with the straight native species. Goldenrods. I've listed a lot of solidagos here, and they're all very different. Some are extremely tall, 6 or 7 feet tall in good garden soils, and some are kind of short and never get taller than about 2 feet. Some have flat tops, some have the big plumes on top, and some have tops that are more or less like sprigs of fireworks exploding. So all of the goldenrods are great for monarchs, great for other pollinators, but you want to think about their habits and where you're placing them in the garden. Some of them will also spread quite freely. And like that late blooming boneset, I can't freely recommend those for everybody's garden because they're going to require some maintenance, keeping them in check. This plant was in my garden. It showed up, volunteer, and I said, hey, that's a goldenrod. Let me see what it does. And in the first year, it was fabulous. It did this. And I thought, that's pretty good. I'm going to keep it. And in the second year, it was 6 feet tall. It had made a 3-foot circle, and it was fabulous, but it was a little too big for that space. So I found a different space in the garden where I could keep it. And it sure enough attracts the pollinators, especially the monarchs in the fall. There's a short goldenrod. This one is only about 2 feet tall. Used to be in a different genus. It's gotten thrown back into Solidago as far as I know. They could have changed that this week. And it is a flat-topped goldenrod, but it's great if you need one that's not as tall. I really like that on my farm. There's a lot of it, and you can see that it's extremely attractive to a variety of butterflies. There it is in full bloom. That's about what it looks like this week, and it will continue to bloom until frost if it gets any water at all, like rainfall. Asters, fall asters, they can be purple, they can be white. They're usually one of those two colors. And fall asters can apply to several different species. So I just left it at that. There's Aster oblongifolius, Aster novangline, Aster praealtus, which is a tall one. And so it just depends, and you got to shop carefully for those depending on your space, because they are different sizes, they are different heights, but they're all attractive to pollinators and monarchs. Here is one at a nature center in it's between Dallas and Fort Worth somewhere, and it's, as you can see, this one stays low. The one on my farm will get about 4 to 5 feet tall, and it's a different species, both called fall aster in some cases. This one's the one at my farm where I have more leisure to stop and photograph the butterflies. You can see quite a few species do use this. And here's something you might not know about asters. Many of the aster species will continue to produce nectar after the outer or ray petals have been eaten off by chewing creatures or have fallen off naturally, because they have those disc flowers in the center. So if you really carefully look at this photo, you're going to find a lot of things happening. There are 5 butterflies, a couple of moths, a couple of beetles. There are some ants. There are some other things in this picture. And this was taken November 3rd, after the plant really didn't look that great anymore, but it was still providing pollinator services. So if there's a place in your landscape where you can possibly just let things be, you're going to be doing a lot of good for pollinators that you might never have realized was possible. We're getting close to the end. We're all the way up to tea, so take heart. If you can stay awake a little bit longer, you'll have it made. This one is one of my big cheats. I love Mexican sunflowers, and if you have a space for them, they're well worth planting. They're annuals, I believe, in most cases. There's a couple of different kinds. But they're big, they're very big. So you're gonna need a lot of space to put in a Mexican sunflower. You can see that this pretty big butterfly, you know, the flower is as big as the butterfly, and the plant itself is huge. So this can be 8 feet tall, covered with these torch-shaped flame-like flowers, and those flowers will in turn be covered with assorted pollinators. This is an American bumblebee. I also give talks on native bees, one of my very favorite species, and honestly, the bumblebees need our help as much as the monarchs do. So I love the Mexican sunflowers. Here's one that was towering over my head in someone else's garden, but I included it just to give you an idea of the scale and the size of this plant. Much smaller would be your Texas vervain, and it is one of the verbenas, one of our native verbenas. Now, you may never have given this plant a second thought. You've probably driven by it a million times. It's pretty widespread, but it is delicate. It's sparse. It's not necessarily full of large blossoms or extremely showy. Nevertheless, it starts blooming in the spring about the same time that that prairie verbena starts blooming, and it will bloom and bloom and bloom. So it covers the entire spring season, where other plants might be having a finicky season. They got too much cold or a slow spring or too much rain or not enough rain. Your verbena halii is going to produce. It is going to be there and be consistent every spring. Other verbenas are just as good for pollinators. They may not be native, but they may produce great nectar. So keep an eye out for verbenas at your stores. There are some verbenas that are invasive, and I'd ask you to keep an eye out for that too. We're starting to find some non-native verbenas that are showing up in the wild. They are becoming invasive plants, and they're not on that official list yet. It may be many years before they go through all the hoops and make that jump to being officially invasive, but it scares me when I see plants beginning to make themselves at home in our wild spaces. Here's that Verbena halii. It's actually pretty attractive once it gets established. It's delicate, but it will put up multiple stems. Cowpen daisy, Verbicina encilioides. Well, there's a push on to call this golden crown beard. Excuse me, I'm going to turn that off again. I didn't realize I had a phone in here with me today. My fault for interrupting myself. And I would go ahead and call this golden crown beard, except there is a relative of this plant that is also called golden crown beard. So I'm going to go ahead and stick with cowpen daisy for now, and maybe somebody will come up with a third name that we can use for this one. Maybe just golden daisy, how's that? Anyway, this one is going to be great for the midsummer and late summer pollinators. It has a really long bloom season. I've seen it bloom in the shade, the part shade, the full sun. It can get a little bit big and rowdy, but it's an annual. So if you don't like it, tear it out or pull out the babies and just don't let them get started. It's not very hard to get rid of if you need to get rid of it in a particular place. This is not my photo, it's Kathy Downs' photo from the hill country. And you can see that it does, or maybe even a little further south, and you can see that it does attract a lot of different pollinators. Whenever I see this in person, it has a lot of pollinators on it. It's usually, I'm busy doing something else like tagging monarchs, so I don't have a camera with me, and I don't have a lot of great pictures of this plant of my own. One of its relatives is frostweed, and I love this plant, especially for shady gardens. It really doesn't mind full shade, part shade, or even full sun if it gets enough moisture in that full sun. And its growth habit is going to vary a little bit. You can find it pretty tall in full shade, but it's going to stay a little bit shorter in the full sun. And either way, it will serve as pollinators. It's a little blurred out in this picture, but you can see a honeybee cruising in at the lower right, where this male monarch is perched and nectaring on the frostweed. This is a fall plant, so don't expect to see it blooming until fall in your area, or at least late summer at the earliest. Here it is again. The honeybee has made a landing, and I think that's a totally different plant, a totally different day, in a really different place, and even a different year, and yet we have the monarch, the honeybee every time, and there's a native bee perched there too. Lots of different species will use this plant. This one is from Kathy Downs again, I believe, and I see a combination of queens and monarchs here just feasting on the frostweed. Now, in your area, this may be a favored plant, or you may have something that they like even better, but it's a fairly safe fallback plant for a shady spot. It's worth putting in. Not a monarch. Frostweed has a parlor trick that makes it kind of fun too in the dead of winter. If you've had a warm day and then suddenly get a hard, sharp freeze, what happens is the stems freeze and split, but sap will continue oozing up from underground and out through those slits. And that sap will freeze into these weird lacy ribbons or frost flowers. And so you look out one day and you think, oh my goodness, my yard has been toilet papered. Who did that? And then you realize, no, it's my frost flowers or frostweed, and it's doing its thing on this cold winter morning. And it's quite entertaining. They can do this several times in a season. So it's not just a once and done, but you got to catch it early in the morning before the sun comes out and melts your frost fairies away. Oh my, we must be getting close to the end. That's a W. So we have Zexbenia, also called Wedelia, And its Latin name has changed a couple times, Wedelia hispida, but it's had a couple of others, so you may find it in books under different names. It's a low plant, it makes a nice low mound and just blooms its head off for much of the summer and on into the fall. It's a favorite with some of our smaller native bees, like this adorable leafcutter lady here. She is loaded up with pollen underneath her abdomen. This is what they look like when they're fully loaded. But you're going to find those green metallic sweat bees. Bees of all kinds and descriptions will be using these in addition to all kinds of butterflies. So it is a good nectar plant. It is a good pollen plant. I recommend this for most pollinator gardens. And here we are in the Z's. Can't be long now. So we've got Zinnia grandiflora. This is actually sort of native to the edges of Texas and desert areas to the west and south of that. I'm not sure the exact range. Most of Texas will not have this as one of their local natives. But if you are looking for an extremely xeric plant that does not need a lot of extra water, this might be something to consider. We also have another zinnia in Texas while I'm on the native zinnias that's wide, or it's at least native to the fringes of Texas toward the west. And both of those are going to need extremely good drainage. Another plant that's white that needs good drainage would be your Blackfoot daisy, which I didn't include today, but could have. That would have been a nice one to include. Similar look on our white zinnia and the Blackfoot daisy, which you might be more familiar with. But the zinnias that you can buy are all cultivars or based on bred from Zinnia elegans, which came out of Mexico. And I really actually like to include this in my Monarch gardens and when I advise people on Monarch gardens for a couple of really good reasons. First of all, it's loaded with high quality nectar and pollen if you get the kinds with the simple centers that the insects can access easily. So they use it. They really use it a lot. It's going to be blooming at the right time of year for them. It has a long bloom season. And a lot of times when you're putting in a new garden, there's that kind of lag time between when you put in your perennial plants and when they are fully established and blooming and looking good. Zinnias can really help fill that gap. They're quick blooming annuals, and so when you put in zinnias, you're going to have a lot of curb appeal in a hurry. And that can be very, very important, sometimes even crucial if you're working on something like a public garden, a library garden, a school garden, any place where the public needs to have a thorough buy-in quickly for that garden to survive and stay in that place. You want to make sure that it makes people happy, that they see things that they like very quickly after the garden goes in. And zinnias and things like mealy blue sage can help with that because they have a very fast turnaround. You don't have to wait a couple of years for them to look their very best. So that brings me to zinnias, and I surprisingly have a little time left, which is shocking. I never have time left. I usually have to be dragged off stage. There's a zinnia with this little guy on the far left that has stolen all the buds off my mealy blue sage and attached them to his body for camouflage. Then he's wandered off onto the zinnia where he's not camouflaged at all. He's just not doing that right. But you can see this zinnia is in a garden where there's a lot of insect activity happening. So not a bad thing to add. Look at the center of that zinnia. Can you see the individual flowers there? It's a composite, and that means that pollinators that visit will stick their long tongues down into each of those little flowers to drink the nectar. Okay, one more bed of zinnias, and I think maybe that is it as far as slides, but I am here to answer your questions until 2. So I don't know if Shane's with us or not. Maybe if I stop.
We've had several requests for a copy of your presentation of your PowerPoint.
Okay.
And then the other request was your contact info what are good resources for more information?
Okay.
Seeds, notes, recommendations. You talked about
Yeah.
certain caveats that would come from experience. Where would they look? Who would they look to get those kind of answers?
Well, I always recommend that you get in touch with your Native Plant Society in your local area. There are chapters all over the state, so there's almost certainly one or more within driving distance for your area. And right now, we're all doing what you're doing, meeting by Zoom. We're not meeting in person. But the people at the Native Plant Society have taught me so much about native plants over the years. They have great speakers and great programs, so you can extend your knowledge of garden plants by adding native plants to your repertoire if you haven't already got those in there. As far as Monarch information goes, I have one key website where you're going to find so much that it will keep you reading for a while, and that is monarchjointventure.org. Run it all together, monarchjointventure.org. And when you get there, you're going to find lots of different tabs where you can read lots of different things. One of those tabs will say resources. And when you click that, it may take a while for it to load, but it will it will load a whole bunch of different things, including downloadables and shareables and things like that, where you're going to find posters, you're going to find bookmarks, and you're going to find, I think, 16 different one-page topic sheets that will tell you all about all kinds of aspects of monarch butterflies. And so for that, that's a great resource. For other pollinators, you can try Xerces. That's Xerces, the Xerces Society, and they have lots and lots of resources available. Other places, National Wildlife Federation has monarch and pollinator resources available. Our own Texas Parks and Wildlife has some pollinator resources available. And so there is so much out there that you could read for a year and not be done. But if you start at Monarch Joint Venture, it's kind of pre-digested in small bites, and it'll be easy to do the reading there.
Carol, we've got a question on the invasive brown lizards. Are they decimating their monarch eggs and caterpillars? What to do about them?
Oh, okay. So you may be talking about the Cuban anoles, and I think I
Yes.
just read some research that they're not actually distinct from the Carolina green ones. They behave differently. They'll even eat them, each other, and things like that. That I don't think there's too much you're going to be able to do except encourage screech owls in your yard. And I would get a screech owl box and put that up and hope that you get screech owls. Because I know that the years that the screech owls have actually nested in my yard, we have had far fewer lizards. And the other option is to enlist a 10-year-old boy and pay him per lizard to take those far away. So that may be your easiest way to get rid of those if you can't get the owls to come and stay with you. Other people will put sort of an organza drawstring bag over a caterpillar when they find it, and over a whole section of branch, and that will allow air and moisture to come and go, but it will keep the lizards from getting to your monarchs. And I forgot to give you my contact information. You can email me through the Native Plant Society at carol.clark@npsot.org. That's the Native Plant Society of Texas, just those initials. And my name is so plain, no E's anywhere, CarolClark. So carol.clark@nipsot.org. Okay, I don't know, did I answer all those questions or did I skip one?
I don't see any more questions. I'm looking back up through it. Let me see. A lot of people saying thank you, great presentation.
Any idea how many we had at our, roughly how many we had?
87 was the most I saw at one time.
Great. Okay, that's good for me to know. I can put that down for master naturalists, right? So I'd love if we have a few more minutes to hear from other people about what they've seen monarchs using in their area. If they have a favorite plant for monarchs, I'd love to hear about it because I collect information all the time. Anybody?
There is another question on the type of soil you would suggest for a milkweed bed.
Oh, okay. It depends on the milkweed. So if you're in Houston and you're growing Asclepias perennis, you can put that directly into an ornamental pond. It is an aquatic milkweed. But if you're in the hill country, I would choose something well drained if you're going with your local milkweeds there. So it's easier to kill a milkweed by retaining too much moisture in the soil than it is to kill one with well drained soils. I'd err on the side of well drained. And not too rich, really. A lot of our milkweeds are thriving out in cow pastures, growing out of cracked chalk, and not really planted in deep, rich soils.
What about shelter plants?
Shelter plants, didn't really cover those, did I? That can be pretty much anything. So a Yopon holly, which is going to have leaves all year, or any little bush or clump grass like a big blue stem or a little blue stem, or a side oats grama that you could include in your landscape really easily. Their leaves kind of droop down and form skirts, and so you'd be surprised what hides under there in a rainstorm or a hailstorm. They can make a good shelter plant.
They're asking about a good source for going back native, good seed sources.
Okay, in Texas, we're pretty lucky. We have a couple of good sources. One of the most common that people shop at is Native American Seed, and they do have milkweed seeds for sale from Texas. Again, I'd advise you to check out that Texas Parks and Wildlife Identifying Texas Milkweeds resource to tell exactly which ones are native to Texas, because they have a couple. Maybe I wouldn't choose those to plant for Texas. But they do have the green, they do have the antelope horns. I think they have the swamp milkweed and maybe a couple of others in their catalog. And then there are some other seed companies that are starting to make the seeds available. One is called Butterfly Encounters, and I think he actually may have moved to Texas recently. But for seeds, check the internet, make sure you know what you're getting, make sure they're not coming from overseas. There's been a lot of trouble with imported seeds that have not properly gone through inspection channels recently. So be responsible and find your seeds from a responsible retailer who knows where those seeds came from.
There's a comment about any advice on setting up a way station on the roadside behind my house. And they say, can I get a sign to prevent the county from mowing? If it is the county roadway in their right of way, you can't stop them from mowing that. They have the authority to do that. But you may, Carol, do you have some experience with that?
I do. Well, not personal experience, but secondhand experience. So all over the country, there are people who've made headway by talking to their county officials that are responsible for that maintenance and saying, hey, I can maybe reduce your maintenance costs, add something that's pretty, and be of great service to pollinators, which are in trouble, if you'll let me do this thing. And they're always going to require some kind of setback for safety. So just plan on that. But ask them, well, okay, if you have to mow 4 feet, 5 feet, 10 feet, whatever your setback is, can I have the part behind that? And tell them what size you're planting. Show them some pictures of what you're planning to plant and see if you can get them to just not mow that one place. If you work with them, it's going to work a whole lot better than if you just try to fight them. And then after that, you probably will have to put up a sign because the guy on the mower may not be the guy you got to agree to the plan. So anything else? We've got 2 official minutes left. It's been so nice to be here with you today, virtually and remotely, and I hope you're all staying safe. But gardening is an activity that you can do and while you're being carefully isolating, and you can still make a difference for monarchs in your own space.
That sounded like a TV promotional ad. Very professionally done, Carol. I like the way you always put a positive twist on things, and definitely an advocate. Appreciate your time. And just from the comments, so many saying thank you, good information. Some were saying they thought they knew a lot about this. A lot of beekeepers on here appreciating the nectar tie-in.
Great, great. Well, you know, if you have time some other time, I do a whole program on native bees, so we can do that too. Well, thank you so much, and I'll just stick around till everybody's off in case somebody has a last-minute question.
If you have a question and your microphone works, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask those questions.
Carol,
Yes.
does porterweed count as a pollinator plant?
I have seen pollinators using it. In my friend's garden in Houston, it was pretty popular. So I would say yes.
Thank you. I have it, and I'm anxious to find out if they like it. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. All right.
Carol, I had pretty good success getting seeds to germinate with my winter gardening. Are you familiar with winter gardening where you plant in your milk your
Yes.
milk jugs?
Yes.
Would I be able to get them viable enough for the spring if I do that? Or do I need to plant them earlier?
So are you asking if you put your jugs out in the spring, is that soon enough?
No. I'm asking if I put them out in December, would the plants be large enough for the spring migration?
Yes, you'll have viable plants in the spring, but they should probably get some first season protection because they will have just started to develop their tap roots at 3 months old. They'll have the beginnings of a tap root, but remember, these are their energy stores from which they'll regenerate if they get chomped off. So if you get one monarch laying eggs on your plant when it just has like 2 baby leaves, that could do in your plant.
Okay. Well, then I'll probably just go ahead and start them this fall, but I found that we just don't get cold enough.
Right. Yeah, there's not enough cold weather
to need that cold striation.
Yeah, the cold stratification in the fridge is the gold standard. Now, there are some new quick start methods out where people soak their seeds in hot water or hydrogen peroxides and things like that. And if you Google milkweed quick start methods, a bunch of those are going to pop up, and you could try those if you have enough seed to spare to try those.
Thank you.
You're so welcome.
Hello.
Can you put up on screen the link to get to the copy of this slideshow and video?
Oh, that's not under my control.
There's not a link to get to it.
Is there going to be one?
That'll be up to Carol as far as sharing her PowerPoint.
I can share my PowerPoint and that'll be fine.
If you'll email it to me, then I can make it available.
Okay, Dropbox link okay to get it to you, and then you can convert to PDF or
That's fine.
Or I'll convert to PDF, whichever.
It doesn't matter, either way.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I've got another meeting that started at 2 o'clock that I need to go to.
You better,
So
you better shut us down then. So thank you very much.
Today's presentation.
Bye-bye. Let's see if I can.